Yeah.
Good evening. Before we begin our meeting, I would like to invoke God's blessings upon this meeting this evening. Dear Lord, we come before you this afternoon at the beginning of a very important exercise, that of a series of town hall meetings to discuss the way forward for our constitutional reform. We ask your blessings upon this exercise, and we ask that you guide the thoughts and actions of our presenters and members of the public, that we can together work in the best interests of moving Anguilla forward. We ask these blessings in your name. Amen.
Amen.
I would like to acknowledge the presence of the Honorable Premier, Dr. Ellis Lorenzo Webster, retired High Court Judge, Justice Don Mitchell, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Home Affairs, Dr. Aidan Harrigan, our technical team here this afternoon, GAF, Titanium Sounds in Anguilla, our Public Relations Officer, Mr. Ivan Connor, our listeners via Radio Anguilla, and our viewers on gov.ai in Anguilla. I begin with the opening stanza of our national song. God bless Anguilla, nurture and keep her, noble and beauteous, she stands midst the sea. O land of the happy, a haven we'll make thee, our lives and love we give unto thee. Fitting words as we launch this exercise here this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this, the first in a series of town hall meetings that the Ministry of Home Affairs is organizing to solicit the views of the general public on constitutional reform. In the APM 2020 elections campaign manifesto policy, by way of a vision statement, we stated inter alia that the Anguilla Progressive Movement, APM, understands that enhancing the foundation of a great society means investing more in its people and empowering them to take ownership of their own destiny. This session here this evening and in the weeks to come is in fulfillment of that policy pledge. On the question of destiny, the United Nations Charter states, all peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely determine their economic, social, and cultural development. A constitution can be viewed as a type of architecture or framework. The Oxford Dictionary defines a constitution as a body of fundamental principles or established precedents according to which a state or other organization is acknowledged to be governed. If we trace back Anguilla's constitutional history to the 1960s, we see a seminal movement as the UK's attempt at decolonization in the Caribbean by creating the West Indies Federation in 1958, when this disintegrated Anguilla was put together with St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla to form the so-called tri-state in association with the United Kingdom. It had a semi-independence constitution with full internal self-government, and the United Kingdom responsible for external defense and foreign affairs. Experiencing a history of neglect under various constitutional arrangements over the centuries as a British colony, Anguillians quickly demonstrated their dissatisfaction with associated statehood and dispatched the police from St. Kitts, the putative administrative center who was stationed here in Anguilla. The events culminated on May 31st, 1967, now known as Anguilla Day, a day which we as Anguillians are taught about from an early age, and one which we cherish and celebrate on an annual basis. There followed declarations of independence, an invasion by a British expeditionary force in 1969, and eventually the UK triggering of a special clause in the West Indies Associated States Act to give rise to the Anguilla Act of 1971, through which Anguilla would be ruled directly from Britain. Since then, we have had several constitutional acts. The 1976 Constitution, which introduced party politics and a ministerial form of government around an all-powerful UK-appointed administrator. The 1980 Constitution, which formally separated Anguilla from the Tri-State, and the 1982 Constitution, which by and large is what governs Anguilla to this day. Since the 2000s, as the UK has tried to comply with the various United Nations declarations for international decades on decolonization, there have been several constitutional reform committees established here in Anguilla. The most recent has been the Don Mitchell, retired High Court Judge Committee of 2015, which after 2 years of public consultations and other meetings, submitted a draft constitution in 2017. The administration of the day, the Anguilla United Front administration, eventually in 2019 submitted 3 pieces from that draft constitution for the consideration of the United Kingdom government to enact by an order in council. This was duly done in May 2019, so that the Anguilla Constitution 2019 amendment provides for 1, the name of the leader of government business to change from Chief Minister to Premier, an increase in the number of elected representatives in the House of Assembly by providing for 4 members elected on an island-wide basis. The 2020 general elections were therefore the first to allow for the election of candidates on this island-wide basis. And 3, grandchildren of Anguillian belongers not born in Anguilla to qualify for Anguilla status. In November 2019, a team from the United Kingdom Foreign and Commonwealth Office visited Anguilla to undertake negotiations on a new constitution with an Anguilla team. The Anguilla team comprised the Premier and other representatives of the administration of the day, the Anguilla United Front, the then leader of the opposition, the leader of the largest opposition party, the APM, members of the Bar Association, and other representatives. The UK negotiating team also met with Anguillians at a town hall meeting. The negotiations were not concluded, and it was decided that they would be discontinued until after the general elections, which were due in the first half of 2020. We are now seeking to restart that process by initiating these town hall meetings to refresh our minds as to the current issues and to seek the candid views of you, the members of the general public. We are somewhat hampered by the health restrictions occasioned by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic in terms of persons being able to physically attend these sessions. But I am pleased that my ministry has been able to team up with the Department of Information Technology, DITES, and Mr. Gilbert Fleming of Titanium Sounds and in Anguilla to provide audio, visual, and streaming for this meeting and the other meetings to come. I also want to acknowledge the invaluable assistance in this regard being provided by my able and capable Permanent Secretary, Dr. Aidan Harrigan, and other staff at the ministry. Following my brief presentation, Dr. Harrigan will give a presentation on Anguilla's constitutional evolution and the key changes under consideration for this round of constitutional reform to set the context for what hopefully will be a robust and energetic round of town hall meetings. I end by quoting from Marcus Garvey as follows: "God and nature first made us what we are, and then out of our own creative genius, we make ourselves what we want to be. Follow always that great law. Let the sky and God be our limit, and eternity our measurement. Fellow Anguillians, let us forge the next steps forward in creating our own destiny by formulating a constitution which sets the path towards the realization of our dreams and aspirations as a free people under God's dominion. Thank you and good evening. Before I invite Dr. Harrigan to make his presentation, I think it's only fitting that we ask our Honorable Premier just to say a few brief words at this occasion. Premier, you can use that mic there, please.
I bid you good afternoon, adopting the protocol already established. And seeing that we are in District 1, I appreciate the honor of being able to speak at this session. As you mentioned earlier, that I was invited to be part of the Anguilla negotiating team back in November of 2019. And we had a very robust discussion on the constitutional reform with the understanding that, you know, as our forebears wanted, they wanted to be in control of their own destiny. And so we do know we have an administering power, and we have to make sure that we present what we, the people of Anguilla, want to see for our own governance going forward, the Constitution being the supreme construct that determines how we are governed. I know you mentioned earlier, you said, I know you misspoke when you said May 31st, Anguilla Day. You meant the 30th, I know you do. So I will correct that for you because, you know, in Island Harbor, this is the center of the revolution of the 1967. So just want to thank those who have gone before and those who are still alive who, you know, helped to make that possible. Because without that, what is called an uprising, we would not be here right now, standing in this place with the freedoms that have been bestowed upon us. And so I want to thank all our revolutionary heroes, past and present. And I do want to thank Justice Mitchell, or retired Justice Mitchell, because when I call him judge, he tells me he's no longer a judge, but we want to thank him for all the efforts that he has put in to, you know, come up with what we call the Don Mitchell Constitutional and Electoral Reform, which was presented back in 2017 and which I think should have been considered in its entirety instead of the piecemeal way in which part of it was, you know, through order and council put in place. I have never been against island-wide voting, and I will state for the record that I'm in favor of Anguilla being one electoral district with 11 seats that should be chosen island-wide. So I know I'm jumping the gun here because that's one of the considerations that will be put on the table, as you have stated in previous press conferences. And so, again, thank you for this process. Thanks for all who've put in the hard work. And as we go forward, I do hope that the people of Anguilla, and today the people of Island Harbor and District 1, will participate, whether it's here in person or on the social media or other means. I want to thank Dites and GAF for the great work they do, and our PRO for being present. So again, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for allowing us to kick off here in District 1, this important part of Anguilla's progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Premier, and my apologies for that slip, May 30. Okay, I now take pleasure in turning the floor over to our Permanent Secretary, Dr. Aidan Harrigan, and he's going to take us through a very thought-provoking presentation which will awaken and refresh our memories as to what has gone on to date. Dr. Harrigan.
Thank you, Minister Hodge, and Good evening to one and all, folks who are here in the hall and also who are listening remotely. I would like to adopt the protocol already established. Okay, so what I have is a presentation to provide some context in terms of Angola's constitutional evolution, and then which goes through some of the key changes, proposed changes for the new constitution. So the presentation is titled Angola Constitutional Evolution. Right? So by way of an international legal mandate, and Minister Hodge would have quoted this in his speech, opening speech, and this is from the United Nations Charter. All peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely determine their economic, social, and cultural development. Now, the United Nations has a classification of territories, what they call non-self-governing territories, and they started to do this way back in 1946 by way of United Nations Resolution 66-1. Also in 1960, the UN, by way of Resolution 1541-15, identified that self-determination is attained through three modes, which they stated as being independence, free association, and integration. The UN in 1961 also established the Special Committee on Decolonization, the so-called Committee of 24. And it's worth noting that the UK and other governing territories are obligated to report on an annual basis on progress with the non-self-governing territories attaining self-determination. The UN declared the first international decade on decolonization from 1991 to 2000 with the intention that those territories would qualify for removal from the list by the end of the period. Suffice to say, that has not happened, and there have been 3 international decades on decolonization since 2001 to 2010, 2011 to 2020, and now the start of the next one, 2021 to 2030. At the end of 2020, there were 17 non-self-governing territories, of which Angola is one. So if we move into the modes of self-determination which the United Nations had outlined, there's independence, which most of us are familiar with. Basically, a country gains its independence and has its own government, and is not ruled by any other state or country. So we have the example of Jamaica, which became independent from Britain in 1962, I believe. There's also free association, which is defined as being the result of a free and voluntary choice by the peoples of the territory concerned, expressed through informed and democratic processes, and should permit the right to determine the internal constitution without outside interference. An example of this is Puerto Rico in association with the United States of America. Then there's integration, which by definition should be on the basis of complete equality between the people of the former territory and the country into which it is being integrated. And an example of that is Martinique and Guadeloupe in our region with France. Okay, so the history of Angola's status, as it were. So Angola was established as a British colony in 1650. It was first administered through Antigua, and then in 1825, administrative control was switched to St. Kitts. As Minister Hodge indicated earlier, in 1967, so jumping, quite a bit, fast forward. The UK established Associated State of St. Kitts, Nevis, Angola, and that was part of the decolonization process where the UK tried to achieve the decolonization of its Caribbean territories in one fell swoop through the West Indies Federation. And as Mr. Hodge mentioned earlier, it associated statehood represented semi-independence. Anguillians did not like this new dispensation, and of course the famous events, May 30th, and then on July 11, 1967, Anguilla seceded from the tri-state following a referendum. A Harvard professor, Roger Fisher, he was a constitutional expert. He drafted a constitution for Anguilla, which was adopted. Independent republic status was declared following a second referendum on February 6, 1969, and the constitution adopted was one formulated by another American, Jack Holcomb. On March 1969, British troops invaded Anguilla, and direct rule from Britain was re-established, eventually through the Anguilla Act of 1971. They followed the Constitution of 1976, which provided for ministerial government. You also had the UK representative in the form of a commissioner, which was under later constitution re-termed as the governor. Then there was the Anguilla Act of 1980, by which Anguilla was granted, even though it had in effect separated, formally and legally. This occurred in December 1980, and there's a holiday for that, which we celebrate. And it's interesting reading the history. This required the consent of the St. Kitts Nevis government. And it happened because at that time, PAM, the People Action Movement, came into office. I think the head was Dr. Kennedy Simmons, who's familiar to some of us, because when he retired as a medical doctor, he came to Anguilla and was the chief medical officer for a number of years. And so they said, we don't have any issue. And so it went ahead, and then St. Kitts, that paved the way for St. Kitts Nevis becoming independent. The constitution currently in effect is the Constitutional Order of 1982, as amended in 1990, and if I remember, I think there were 2 or 3 amendments. 1991 was for the leader of to appoint the position of leader opposition, and then there were 1 or other 2 which Mr. Mitchell, Justice Mitchell can enlighten us. I've currently, escaped me, sorry. And then the amendments which occurred in 2019, which Minister Hodge would have mentioned earlier. So, recent constitutional reforms. So in the 1999, the UK published a very important policy paper called Partnership for Progress and Prosperity, which outlined the principles where the UK would seek to govern and administer the overseas territories. And some felt that this actually, yes, the United Nations edicts and so on, but many people felt that what happened with Montserrat as a result of the volcanic eruption and the deaths there, and most 2/3 of the country being put off limit, and the British response. And if you recall, the demonstrations were criticized by one Claire Short, who I think was a minister for international development, said they want golden elephants. So the question was, what of these territories in disparate parts of the world, and who was responsible for them? Were they responsible for themselves completely, or who was partially responsible, or whatever? And as I said, that seemed to have sparked a review of the policies of the UK government towards these territories. So they were restyled overseas territories from dependent territories, and they were encouraged by the UK government to establish constitutional review commissions. The UK was quite clear in stating that for those territories that wish to become independent, they could do so once it was the clearly expressed wish of the people, as expressed through a referendum, for example. But the UK government was equally clear to say, in terms of the other United Nations options, that certainly that it was not interested and was not inclined to allow for integration with the UK or free association with the UK. So there's an error on the thing. I put integration twice. Whether or not this would allow such arrangements with third countries, I guess that has never really been tested, although there was some flirtation interest by the TCI government in the 1980s, I think, and to a lesser extent more in the 1990s, of being in free association with Canada. Okay, so constitutional reform exercises in Anguilla. There was the David Carty Constitutional Committee in 2001. However, despite having a number of meetings and hearings and so on, no recommendations were made, although speeches and transcripts of meetings were subsequently published. Of note, for the first time, I think, in 2003, the United Nations had there was a UN decolonization seminar in Anguilla. I remember I was a junior civil servant. I went to that. The UK would have sanctioned it. In fact, the UK was represented by, I think at that time, the deputy head of the Overseas Territories Directorate in the FCO. And it was taken very seriously, so much so that the United Nations Secretary General would have asked for a statement to be placed in the record from himself, which included the following: achieving self-government for the peoples of the world has been one of the cardinal goals of the United Nations since its inception. In 2006, Justice Mitchell was appointed to lead a new exercise, and that was, I think, done within 6 months, but no constitutional change occurred. And then in 2015, showing that he still had the appetite and was willing to serve, Mr. Mitchell again agreed to head up a committee, and the report was tabled, and a draft constitution submitted in January 2017. So the draft constitution of 2017, just I think of note, just a quote from Mr. Mitchell, where going back to the UK's constitution, he said that it could be, and I hope I'm not misquoting, but he's right here, so he can correct us, could be termed as a constitutional dictatorship, referring to the provision under the 1981 Anguilla Act, where Anguilla could be ruled through an order in council, imposed without any discussion, far less consent by the governed. And this is not theory, because if we see the other overseas territories, they have similar provisions, and this was in fact exercised, I think it was 2007 or 2008 in TCI, where the UK unilaterally suspended their constitution, citing bad governance, widespread and endemic corruption, and so on. Mr. Mitchell would have noted that based on the consultations arising out of that round of constitutional reform, two main demands from the public came to the fore. One, that there needed to be to be improvements in democracy and what the Constitution allows, and 2, to improve standards in public life. So the recommendations arising out of that committee's reform exercise were centered around that. And in terms of increasing the democracy, they would have focused, for example, on increasing the number of elected representatives, and Minister Hodge touched on this earlier. So Chapter 6 of the new draft Constitution refers to the House of Assembly, and that proposed increasing the number of elected members to not less than 13, while eliminating non-elected members. The specific section is Section 53.3. And as Mr. Hodge would have said, okay, let me just go further, then I'll comment. Chapter 6 also proposes that Anguilla be a single electoral district, and we shall return no less than 4 members to the Assembly, and that specific reference is Section 67.1a, and provision for no less than 9 individual district members, Section 67.1b. Right. So what happened in effect with the Order in Council in May of 2019? The provision for voting at large was effected. However, there were no changes to the number of electoral districts, and maybe just as well, because moving on to the recommendations, Chapter 6 proposes that changes made to the number of electoral districts should be made by way of law. This is what the commission or the committee was recommended, and that this should have first been informed by a district boundaries commission, and this is proposed in Section 53.4. Further, they felt that this was also it's been a numbers exercise also, and that it would be prudent to have, I think the next population census in Anguilla was due in 2020, I think, to this year, but it has been moved back. And so the committee felt that the results of the census should feed into that exercise. And so the point being that increasing, as far as the committee was concerned, increasing the number of elected representatives, for example, would, while limiting the number in the executive council, would ensure that members of EXCO did not dominate the House of Assembly, the legislature, therefore making it what is called a rubber stamp. Also in this section, I think I missed this out, I mentioned earlier. Chapter 6 also proposes that the 2 ex officio members in the House of Assembly, the Attorney General and the Deputy General, should be reduced to non-voting members, and the specific section is Section 53.3. And it's interesting to note this provision, given all the furor, as it were, that has occurred with the voting by the AG and the DG to pass the GST bill in July 2021. As the Premier would have mentioned in his comments earlier, in terms of improving the representation of to the House and so on, there are more than one option, and Minister Hodge would have mentioned that in a recent government press conference. So the committee was saying, okay, increase the numbers from 7 electoral districts to 9. And we know that in the current districts, there's an imbalance of population. So you have small districts, relatively small districts, say like Sandy Hill District 2, and then District 7, which is West End. And then you have large districts like Valley, both Valley South and Valley North. And so there's a view that you could maintain the 7, but have a redistribution of the population, of the voters across the 7 districts. Of course, it wouldn't affect, improve the issue that the committee was trying to make about the parliament not being a rubber stamp. As the Premier would have indicated, there's also a view that that perhaps all the positions in the House of Assembly should be elected on an island-wide basis. So that's something that, as we go about these town hall meetings, we would be grateful to hear from the communities, and of course you can make your views known and by speaking. We would also provide our email addresses later on, and you can write to those email addresses, or you can drop off a letter or whatever at the Ministry of Home Affairs. Okay, so improving standards in public life, very important. The committee would have made reference to Chapter 6, and one of the provisions there that was recommended that there should be regulation of campaign finance. For many years now, we've heard people making allegations that the big developers and so on in Anguilla tend to have influence over the process of policy making and law making in Anguilla because they would contribute to campaigns in Anguilla, but there is zero transparency in this regard. And so therefore, that provision is meant to shed light on that and counter that behavior if it happens. Chapter 9, another very important provision, and I remember listening to a session on the Constitution sometime back, I think Dame Bernice Lake, when I think she was asked about independence and so on, and she said, yeah, it all depends on your Constitution and having the checks and balances to necessary, and one area would be institutions, governance institutions, and provisions to protect good governance. So examples of that are Public Service Commission, the Police Services Commission, Electoral Boundaries Commission. There are listed of them there. I won't go through all. Procurement is a big issue in Anguilla and has always been, and it's one of those areas that is seen that, in fact, why you have public procurement is to protect against corruption and to get value for money. Appointments Commission, another very, topic of the day is the boards and who gets on the boards. And the view of the committee was that the various acts which govern, say, like the Health Authority or the ASPA, would, say what the requirements are, that there should be a special appointments commission which would deal with, who would be appointed, our recommendations, who would be appointed. Integrity Commission, a commission's inquiry, which is at a very high level. We know that there's Public Accounts Committee, which tends to haul public servants to give account, but then when there is questions of lack of good governance on the part of elected officials, that is where commissions of inquiry come in. And then there are also provisions for recommendations for commissioners, so Human Rights Commissioner, Complaints Commissioner, Freedom of Information Commissioner, and Police Commissioner, and so on. So I think that is a very, those areas are very key. And again, we'd be very interested to hear the views of the public on that. Another area for improving standards in public life is Chapter 10, which has to do with public finance. And again, this is a very, very topical area at the moment, and all kinds of charges and counter charges by various persons who would have been in government over the years that they didn't do the requisite job, and at the end of the day, it's the taxpayer who bears the brunt. What we've noticed, as you said earlier, Angola's constitution goes back to 1982, the current one for the most part, and we have been the last to really move forward in terms of a new constitution. So one of the things that we've done, SPOT and the committee too would have done, is to look at the constitution in the various territories, Montserrat, Cayman, TCI, and so on, BVI. And you would find that in the 1982 constitution, provisions very scant in terms of what relates to public finance. In fact, I think it's limited to a few areas like there's the appointment of a chief auditor to conduct the audit of government, what it says about pensions and a few other areas. And what is being proposed, as I said in the note there, the Ministry of Finance really has to review the proposals and advise, and hopefully we can flesh those out in subsequent rounds. But the most up-to-date in this area or the most fleshed out in terms of territories is the TCI. And what it has sought to do is to remove a fair bit of discretion from the process, and enshrine these in the Constitution. Not only that, I mean, there are enabling acts which deal with public finance, like the Financial Administration and Audit Act. We know there's a lot of talk about the Financial Fiscal Responsibility Act, and there's a Procurement Act and so on. But the recommendation is that these provisions should be put in the Constitution itself. Now, there's one viewpoint that, well, the Constitution gets done maybe every 10 years. In our case, you see, it's been in train for since the 1980s. So once it's in there, it's unlikely that there'll be any change, for a long time, and that potentially is a drawback. But as I said, once the Ministry of Finance gives some guidance, we would populate that section and in the subsequent rounds and again solicit your views there. So apologies, I didn't go through in chronological and numerical order for the chapters, but I think you can still follow. Chapter 3, and bear this in mind when you said that the process, that one of the things that the commission or the committee would have highlighted was in terms of democracy. So Chapter 3 deals with the power of the governor, and it's worth saying here that there's no real reduction in the powers of the UK appointed governor as such. In that sense, it continues with the trends established way back in 1982 and so on. As mentioned, there's no provisions for full internal self-government, which would have been there in some earlier constitutions. The UK maintains that as long as Angola and other territories choose to remain as UK territories, the UK must retain executive and legislative powers through the governor and the Secretary of State to ensure compliance with UK international obligations, maintenance of good governance, and to manage UK contingent liabilities. So this is exercised in various means. I think one of the areas that will come to mind for most people is certainly came more in use, and since 2010 elections, you find that for the budget, for example, whereas in the past once it was passed in the House of Assembly, the UK government, through the governor, would tend to first, well, the governor would assent to it after getting approval from the FCO minister. But this is an area where the UK government has shown that it's increasingly willing to exercise its powers in that area. Because Anguilla fiscal and financial situation, is a contingent liability on the UK government. It has been proven. The question was asked about Montserrat. Surely. And certainly here in Anguilla's case, it after Hurricane Irma in 2018, where we saw that the UK government, after Irma in 2017, UK government stepped up and provided UK taxpayer money to the tune of, I think, 230 million EC dollars to reconstruct social infrastructure and health, education, and other areas. Of course, also the UK international obligations in terms of human rights provisions and so on, environmental conventions and so on. And Anguilla itself are party to some of these obligations. In terms of the executive, Chapter 4, the Chapter 4 states that executive authority of Anguilla shall be vested in Her Majesty. And this is section 34.1. Chapter 4 also provides for the executive authority of the government of Anguilla to be renamed from Executive Council to Cabinet. So that's one of what is being proposed, and that is section 35.1. And it says that Cabinet shall consist of the Premier, renamed from Chief Minister, not more than 5 other ministers, 2 ex officio members, the AG and DG, and they recommended that they should not vote, and that Her Majesty appoints a governor who shall chair, and that's section 35.1. Currently, with the Ardent Council that came into effect in May, and following the general elections of last year, the number of ministers increased from 4 to 5. Here, it's recommended that actually it could have as many as 6. Yeah. So that's the executive. I mean, key features there, what they have mentioned. Protection of, Chapter 1 deals with protection of fundamental rights, and if subsequently, I mean, we have the material here so we can get into that detail, but this is where, as would have Minister Hodge and the Premier would have mentioned, there were negotiations in November, and the UK government was key to respond formally. They've what is it called? They would have discussed it, and these are reflected in the minutes of those negotiations, and we have those notes. And they would have followed up with a red line copy to show what they would require from their end to make that section compliant to what they would require to satisfy their international obligations. I should have mentioned also that they would have responded quite in detail also on the powers of the governor, the executive. Right, a question that is subject to much debate, and perhaps fittingly so, because Anguilla, after all, if you were to Google unilateral declarations of independence, you'll find that there haven't been too many of those in the world history, but Anguilla features. And the question is, on independence, should the Constitution have a clause that provides a framework for triggering the process of independence? This was also discussed at the negotiations which were held in November of 2019, and the UK pointed out that the Anguilla Act of 1980 is crafted in a way that if Anguilla is the will of the Anguilla people to go independent, that could be exercised, could be triggered, and they in their view, that will could be expressed if there's either a referendum or, say, for example, a particular election campaign. If a particular party ran on that as a main plank and they were elected into office, then that could be. Question is that sufficient in terms of a pathway, should, if and when Anguilla decide they want to go that route? So we would like to hear from you on that as well. And then, I'm almost coming to an end. The May 2019 Constitution amendments, again, they were highlighted by Minister Hodge and the Premier. One being change from Chief Minister to Premier, the provision for election of members on an island-wide basis, and then a provision for Anguilla status to be granted if you're a grandchild of an Anguillan belanger, but you were born, outside of Anguilla. So to conclude, you said, well, there are probably three fundamental questions to ask of you, the public. One, do the proposed changes satisfy the demand for increased democracy? Do the proposed changes satisfy the demand for improved standards in public life? And then, sort of a catch-all, are there any other principles of note or provisions which you would want reflected in the revised constitution or to be tabled? So with that, I thank you, and as I said earlier, if you want to write in your comments, you can do so by email. Of course, you're free to also contribute to the discussion now. So with that, we open the floor, and I think, Gaff, people can patch in, right? Either we can read their questions. Can they? They can talk to. They can call in. No. Okay. So you'd have to type your questions and so Mr. Hodge. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harrigan, for a very comprehensive presentation. As I said, it really stirred back up the issues that would have been raised over the last exercise. And so you want to open the floor for questions now. We have a few persons now in house. We have a mic in the center of the room. And as I said, we can capture your questions online, whichever of the platforms that you are currently streaming on. If you are following gov.ai or in Anguilla, any of those platforms. And just Lloyd's Live as well. So we have 3 streaming platforms that are all integrated, and so we can capture all your questions from those platforms. So anyone in the audience? I just wanted to highlight something that the PS said about the proposals for the districts. There were a number of options that we are putting on the table. There were actually 5 options. One is that we maintain the current status quo, so we do nothing. Then there's another suggestion that we split districts 3 and 4 into 2 additional districts. That makes it 9. Another option is that we split the 7 districts into 9. So this would be splitting the districts more on an equi sort of distant boundaries situation. So the difference between just splitting 3 and 4 as opposed to withdrawing the boundaries for all 7 into 9. And then there was another option where we split the existing 7 into a new 7, but this would be more equitably distributed. And this one is exciting for me because we were able to see the modern software down at planning, where they were able to map these 7 districts using the road network. So that's an option as well. And then, of course, as the Premier would have said, and he has indicated his preference for having the island as one giant electoral district. So those are the options we'll be putting on the table. Nothing is cast in stone, and we definitely want to hear people's views on those various options as we move along. So we invite Mr. Timothy Hodge from District 1. Yes?
Okay, good evening, everyone. If you can go up to the slide very early on where I think the first page with the that one right there, Don Mitchell's, where the next one, next slide. Not that one. Back up one. Go back up. You just skipped over one. Up one. Up one. The one that talked about the rubber stamp. That was the last words of the phrase. Okay. That is also what was said by, yes. Increasing the number of elected representatives while limiting the number in Executive Council ensures that the members of EXCO do not dominate the Assembly, making it a mere rubber stamp. The phrase that was used by, I can't remember the exact phrase used by Dame Bonus Lake, QC, the late Dame Bonus, but she also spoke to this years ago when she was on the first Constitutional Committee, which I was on as well in 2001. And what was proposed then, and I don't know what happened to proposals, but it said that there were no recommendations, but certainly there were papers that were written. I recall delivering a paper on the nominated members, to be or not to be. And that has ceased to be, but that was a discussion then at that point. But what the position being, the point being made by Dame Bonus then, and I think is being made by this Constitutional Committee as well, is that you should not have the members of the Executive Council constituting a majority of the government side of the House of Assembly. If you do, then you have exactly the situation that occurred with the GST vote, where you were told that you had to vote, since you voted in the Executive Council, you had to vote this way, here, in Parliament. That does not give backbenchers the opportunity to have their say and really represent the views of their constituents. Executive Council, House of Assembly, a Parliament is essentially, as this says, rubber stamps what Executive Council decides. And therefore, what's the sense of the Parliament, which is supposed to be the highest authority in the land? So, this is not unique to the Angola situation. I recall reading before Ralph Gonzalez became Prime Minister of St. Vincent, I think it is his book that talked about constitutional dictatorship of the Prime Minister, where essentially what happens in cabinet rules the day. And that's not to be. It should not be. The Parliament should be the voice of the people. And so, how do you achieve this? You do not achieve this with any of the proposals suggested just now. The numbers just do not make sense, do not work. You cannot have 5 ministers of government in the Executive Council, or 6, in not having Parliament be rubber stamp, if you only have 11 members, or even 13 members in the House of Assembly. So therefore, the maths do not work. And maths is maths. They don't lie. I keep telling people that. So what this calls for, if you're going to have 5 or 6 ministers, and I believe you need 5 or 6 ministers, you may need more. It then means that the parliament must have a larger number of representatives. How do you get a larger number of representatives? Everybody says the minute you mention a larger number of representatives, well, who's going to pay them? Well, who says that they must get paid? Or who says that what they get paid has to be so much money that it creates an issue? What are we really trying to achieve here? Are we really trying to achieve the best possible ideas and decision-making that is representative of what the people of Anguilla need and deserve, or are we trying to save money? So let us think, for example, if we had a parliament of 21. You say, well, why 21? A little smaller like Anguilla? Well, Bermuda is smaller than Anguilla. It has 50, more than 50 persons in parliament. Yes, it has a bigger population. But let us try to see what is the value in having a larger number of representatives. Immediately you eliminate that problem, that issue, which is a serious issue. And we just saw it coming to the fore here in Anguilla for demonstration purposes, maybe, but certainly we saw the issue of the Executive Council being the dominant bloc in the parliament, which means that parliament essentially was a rubber stamp. So let's say if we had 21 members, how do we get to 21? Well, you have first past the post and elect the first 21 persons, the highest number of vote getters. If you had a single island-wide district, if you had 7 constituencies, you elect 3 persons for each constituency. You know, there are different options that we can do. You want to get the best out of each constituency. You want to get the best ideas, the best minds, etc. It does not have to be an expensive undertaking. So, you pay the 21 persons, if it's 21, you know, $1,000 a month. It costs less than what it costs now. And then those who are going to perform, so my good friend here, he's a minister of government, he gets a salary in addition to his stipend. So does the minister, and so does the speaker, honorable speaker, I think she's behind here, etc. Right? I mean, well, the speaker would not be, well, no, the speaker could come from the parliament, which is also something which is done in other countries. But it doesn't have to be. But just, let's not discuss that right now. The idea is that we have a number of persons. Now, what does that do? If the doc here runs against 2 of his first cousins, you got family division in Island Harbor. When you could have had the 3 persons elected, if they are the 3 best and brightest minds or whatever that you want will represent the constituency of number 1. So the objective is to get 1, eliminate that issue, which can only happen mathematically by increasing the number of seats in a bigger jump than from 7 to 9 or to 11 or to 13, or reducing the size of the Executive Council, which doesn't make sense. I've already said you need 5, 6, maybe 7 ministers. Right, Mr. Hodge? Minister Hodge? Yeah, because you can't kill a minister. The minister has responsibilities, ministerial responsibilities across a vast array of subjects. So I'm not saying reduce the size of Executive Council or Cabinet, as was also another recommendation. But let us have a larger number of seats in Parliament. And I would suggest, my suggestion before we had the island-wide seats was 2 from each constituency, which would be 14, and 7 island-wide. That was my recommendation then. You can now see 3, where you can do that way. You can have, but in having 2 from each constituency, you eliminate a lot of the animosity and the bad blood that trying to elect one achieves or accomplishes. And I just wanted to leave it at that for now, but certainly a larger number, the feedback, the kickback, the pushback is going to be, how are you going to pay for them? Easy, easy, easy. Nobody says there is a job that you have to pay this person for. It is a mission and a contribution to your country and to your constituency. And then you see, when you've got a number like that, then you can have, and if you want to use the U.S. Virgin Islands as an example, where there are different commissions, and here we have them too, but much more limited. But you'd have parliamentary commissions that would do things, and you would involve the elected members now in these issues. Beyond going to the House of Assembly and either proposing or opposing, and then be locked into opposition because you voted that way in cabinet, and therefore you have to vote that way in parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hodge, for your thought-provoking comments, ideas, and suggestions. So we have a question online. You have a mic?
Good evening. The question online reads, where and how was Chapter 6 formulated?
Thank you. Well, I'll try to answer that. I'm not too sure which Chapter 6, how and why was Chapter 6 formulated. Well, Chapter 6 of the 1982 Constitution is the one that sets up the House of Assembly. It's found in every Commonwealth Constitution. It's a normal chapter in every constitution because every constitution says that laws will be made by the legislature, which is basically the House of Assembly. The House of Assembly and the Queen. The legislature of Anguilla is the House of Assembly plus the Queen. That's our legislature. But overright. So where did the proposed new Chapter 6 came from? Chapter 6 is not Chapter 6 of the Don Mitchell Constitution. I keep hearing people saying that, but it's not fair. The 2017 draft Constitution was prepared by a committee which included lawyers such as Christy Richardson, representing the AUM, Stanley Reed, who's a famous member of the ANA and the APP, Pam Webster, independent. She had her Mary Horsford on the committee, and we all took part in the drafting. So it's not any one of us that is responsible for this Constitution. And secondly, what we strove to do and what we reminded ourselves while we were drafting is that we must not put into the draft our pet ideas. We must try to reflect the views of the majority of the people who made submissions, whether in writing or at different meetings, the different proposals that came forward. We must try to distill the essence of the recommendations of the proposals and make them our recommendations. So let me give you an example. I personally am in favor of the entire island being one constituency, one electoral district, which elects however many number of representatives, as Dr. Webster suggested. I think that that is really the best way to go because of principle. A district representative has such a small number of people to represent that he only has to, I'm going to be unfair now and say bribe, a small... only has to influence a small number of people in his or her constituency to get elected. Whereas if you represent the whole island, there will be nobody would be able to allege any misbehavior on the part of a representative, because a representative cannot influence that many people in an improper way. I prefer that way. However, there is a large number of Anguillians who like the idea of having representatives represent the interests of a particular area in Anguilla. So you have a representative for Blowing Point and South Hill who represents Blowing Point and South Hill. But the truth is, Mr. Chairman, if you will allow me to generalize, the truth is that representatives, once they are elected, no longer really try to push their district forward and get things for their district. Their colleagues would frown on that. Once they are elected, they are there now representing really the entire country. And they do act, generally speaking, in that way. I mean, I never heard anybody say that Victor Banks got special development projects for Victor Banks's constituency, or I've never heard it alleged that Dr. Webster is pushing for certain developments for Island Harbour. I've never heard that, ever in the history of Anguilla heard that. So that we might as well form, my personal view, which is not reflected in this draft, because this draft reflects the view of the majority of Anguillians at the time, as we understood it. My personal view would be to favor the whole island being one which is represented by at-large candidates. It is entirely for this government to decide what it wants to recommend to the British government, and I certainly wouldn't have any objection if you decided to recommend that. On the size of the House of Assembly, I wonder how many of us here realize that we could tomorrow have 21 representatives under our present constitution. Are you aware that our constitution doesn't say there must be 7 representatives? The constitution says that elections in Anguilla shall be arranged under a law to be passed by the House of Assembly and shall consist of not fewer than 7 representatives. So it's a minimum. The 7 is a minimum. So if the House of Assembly decided tomorrow to pass a new elections law which said there shall be 21 representatives, it would be within the present constitution. It doesn't even need a new constitution to do that. So that is that. On the other point about, I like Mr. Tim Hodges' suggestion about having many more representatives, and I agree with him that it doesn't involve cost. We could have 21 representatives at a lower cost than the present, 11. We could have 21, because being a representative in an Anguilla House of Assembly, which meets at the most 2 or 3 days a month, is not a full-time job. Being elected to represent Anguillans in the House of Assembly should be viewed as an honor, a privilege. How many of us get to be called the Honorable Dr. Ellis Lorenzo Webster? It's an honor. It's an honorable thing to be a representative in the House of Assembly. Shouldn't that be reward enough? Yes, a per diem, because many members of the House will be losing their opportunity to earn a living on those days. So a per diem for the days that you attend the House of Assembly would be perfectly in order. It is up to the House of Assembly to pass the relevant law. It doesn't have to be that it's a full-time job, because it isn't a full-time job. In fact, you might say it's a disgrace that people actually think that if they get elected to the House of Assembly, they're going to get a full-time salary for just working 2 or 3 days in a month. That is a shame. It shouldn't be so. That is my view on that. So Mr. Hodge is right, and there's nothing wrong with 21 representatives. Mr. Hodge is consistent. Every time I've heard him speak on this topic for the last 20 years, he's been suggesting 21 members. So he hasn't changed. One overall point I'd like to make before I grab my seat, because I mightn't get a chance to make it again, I'm going to take advantage of my position in front of the microphone. Anguilla's first constitution under the modern system was the 1976 constitution. That was imposed by the British on us because we were part of an associated state at the time. So it was an associated state constitution. The only change that they made in it from the previous St. Kitts, Nevis, and Anguilla associated state constitution was to put in the powers of the governor, to increase the powers of the governor, because we were a colony. We were a colony then, and we are a colony now. We are not any different from an ordinary colonial, in an ordinary colonial relationship with the British government. The British were forced to change colony because they said to the United Nations, we agree with you that no country should have colonies, so we're not having any colonies anymore. We only have overseas territories. But the regime didn't change, really and truly. I know the Partnership for Progress said it would change, but they still kept the nuclear option of being able to crush anything that we did whenever they wanted. So we are a colony still. The second constitution, the 1982 constitution, was Angola's first colonial constitution. It is entirely colonial, drafted by the Colonial Office with the assistance of a committee which included no lawyers under the chairmanship of Reverend Leonard Carty. Ronald Webster, in 1980, when he won power, decided he wanted to change the constitution. He wanted a new constitution, and the British went along with him. And the only thing he was interested in was that the constitution must be changed to provide that if a motion of no confidence succeeds, the governor must call a general election. That was the only thing he was interested in, because, of course, that's how he lost power in 1977, when Hubert Hughes moved the motion of no confidence against his government. And Emil Gums, Albina Lake Hodge, and Idalia Gums took up their chairs physically and moved their chairs around to Mr. Hubert Hughes' side of the House of Assembly. Ronald Webster was left sitting alone on the government side of the House of Assembly, and the governor decided to appoint a new government of whoever the majority of the House supported, and they all told him they supported Emil Gums, so he appointed Emil Gums, and we know the confusion that followed after that. So Ronald said this must never happen again. He wants general elections to be obligatory if anybody moves a successful motion of no confidence. Other than that, it was a British colonial constitution imposed upon us, and there was no legal input from Angola into that constitution. The 2017 draft constitution, the one that was proposed by the Constitutional Committee of 2015, which gave its report and its draft constitution in 2017, is the first indigenously drafted constitution for Angola. It is the first constitution which has come out of the mouths of Angolan people. It is not imposed by the British. It is not a historical thing. It is our idea of what we would like. Take, for instance, Chapter 10, the public finance regulations. The British told us in 2015 that they were so angry with Angola's continued reluctance to follow the provisions in our financial acts, the Finance and Audit Act and all the other acts. They were so angry with us that they were going to impose an order in council removing all financial responsibility for Angola from the Ministry of Finance and giving it to a British financial advisor who would have power to block anything done in Executive Council, to abolish any law passed by the House of Assembly, to stop any minister from doing anything that impacted the finances of Angola, which he didn't agree with. Mr. Banks's administration negotiated with the British and persuaded them not to pass that order in council because they would accept the financial advisor, provided that he came in on the understanding that he would advise only. The British said, okay, but we reserve the right to impose the order in council if you don't improve your finances. In recent years, as everybody in government or who talks to government ministers know, in recent years the British have come back and they've said, you all are still not following the recommendations of the chief auditor. The chief auditor keeps pointing out in his report, his last report published in 2020, I think it was, he continues to point out that the Angolan government continues to ignore all of the financial provisions in the acts governing how public finances are to be spent. And they have said that they're going to impose it again. So what we agreed to do, the committee of 2015, which reported in 2017, we agreed, you know what? We are going to take the order in council and we're going to put it into our constitution with certain amendments. There were certain things that were absolutely outrageous. We took those out. But generally speaking, the regime for governance of Angolan public finances in Chapter 10 is word for word the 2015 draft British order in council. So the British are not going to allow any fundamental changes to it. We'll be lucky if they accept it with the few small changes that we have made, that the committee has made. But they're not going to accept any watering down of it, because that is their main concern about the government of Angola, public finance. They're not going to allow it to be watered down. And when we come to watering down, Mr. Chairman, the 2017 draft is an integrated provision. You change one section, as was done in 2019, and you don't know what the implications are going to be for other sections. You can't cherry pick. My hope is that the government of this day will say, you know what, since so many Anguillians have expressed their views and are in favor of the proposals which are in the 2017 Constitution, we are going to adopt it wholesale. We are not going to make any changes unless we are absolutely sure that it's not going to impact adversely any other section of the draft Constitution. So that would be my urging, to stick to the draft. If you're going to make any changes, let them be good ones and let them not negatively impact on other parts of the Constitution. Thank you.
Stick 1 minute there, Justice. Any other questions on the live?
Which system will get rid of the party system?
Well, the party system, I know in Anguilla, people like to preach and say that the party system has destroyed Anguilla. But it's hypocritical to say that. Brothers and sisters fight with each other, and they're not in a political party. You don't have to be in a political party to be unfair or take advantage of other people. The advantage of having a political party is that everybody in a group, in a movement, everybody in a movement agree that they're going to stick to certain principles. They adopt what we call traditionally a manifesto. If you have everybody running on their own ideas and getting elected, what kind of an administration are you going to get when a few of them come together and decide to form the government? A party is a way of organizing political candidates, persons who want to serve the community under an umbrella. That's all a party is. It's an umbrella of similarly minded people who want to make a contribution to the governance of their country. I am not in favor of getting rid of the party system simply because I recognize that it is based on a misunderstanding of what a party does, and it's purely hypocritical. It's people who want to look as if they're making a sensible contribution when in fact they don't even understand what they're talking about. There's nothing wrong with a political party if it's properly organized. Campaign financing, for example. If we adopt the 2017 Constitution, a party will be bound by the Constitution to publish its accounts. The party will be responsible for making sure that each of its members keeps proper accounts, and they will be penalized. They will lose their seat in the House of Assembly, or they will risk losing their seat in the House of Assembly if they do not keep proper accounts. It is the party that is responsible for coordinating all the accounts. Who is going to sit down and study 21 different members' individual little accounts to see what is correct and what is not correct, when in fact there are just two parties who could publish their, or let me remind you, the accounts must be audited under the proposed campaign financing provisions of the Constitution. The accounts must be audited. You can't have 21 candidates providing audited accounts. It's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. If there are 2 or 3 parties, yes, you can see that they could be able to afford to have an auditor audit their accounts. So I, for a number of reasons, I don't understand the sense of getting rid of the party system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
I'll allow you to take your seat. Yes. Yes, we welcome the speaker.
Evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. I don't speak as the speaker tonight.
No,
But
you're a
as
member of District 1.
Member of District 1.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I just have a question. I don't know who it's going to be directed to, so I'll just direct it to the chair. I came in late, so my apologies. I missed the presentation, but I was just wondering if there were any provisions made for a Freedom of Information Act under the new Constitution. Thank you.
So there's a chapter,
there's a chapter, maybe I'm, 9. Yes, right, which provides for institutions and individuals protecting good governance, and that is one of the proposals, that there should be a freedom of information commissioner, among others. There are also proposals for like a complaints commissioner, which I think is supposed to operate like a ombudsman, type role. Again, other commissions or commissioner that were proposed is, for example, police complaints commissioner. Also of interest, because you know that one is quite topical now too. The compensation of members of the House and members of the government, the salaries and pension, and so in other countries, I think in the UK, for example, that is a special commission that does the analysis and so on. Whereas, so again, it's again to avoid these instances or appearances where people are seen to be like self-dealing and so on. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other inputs from the floor? Anyone else would like to share, ask questions, comments? Okay.
Just as I said, Mr. Mitchell would have spoken at length about the finance provision, so I think, yes, it would be good. We can premiere if we can get some input. You know, maybe for the next session or the one after that, we can populate that section so people can see. As I would have said, there's been quite an evolution. If you go from 1980 to the most recent, I think was TCI, you see in every instance there's tended to be more and more provisions in terms of public finance put in the constitutions. Yeah.
Just a follow-up. Which ministry houses? Sorry. I just wondered which ministry houses this commissioner?
Which one? The Freedom of Information?
Information Commissioner. Which?
Yeah. Which
Freedom
ministry?
of Information.
Which ministry? Yeah. Yes.
So, Mr. Chairman, the Constitution says that there must be a commissioner or a commission, but it doesn't say any of the administrative details. What it says is that all of the arrangements will be made according to a law passed by the House of Assembly. So depending on the Freedom of Information Act, which is the act that will implement the constitutional provision for the commissioner to function, is the one that will say something like, this commission shall operate without any public financial support. Leave the commissioner to do his or her business from their sitting room. I'm not saying that that's an ideal situation, but there's no reason why it couldn't say that if it was appropriate. Or it could say the commissioner shall prepare a budget for administrative management of the functions of the commission, which shall be approved by the House of Assembly. And so there will be a provision to rent a little budget will be prepared for renting property, or if the government has a room available, government may say, no, we're not going to recommend to the House of Assembly approving a budget for you to rent somebody's room. We will provide you with quarters in the Ministry of Home Affairs or in the Ministry of whatever. All of that will be decided in an act which will be debated in the House of Assembly and passed into law.
Thank you very much. Premier?
Adopting the protocol by Madam Speaker that she was not presenting as Speaker, I will not be Premier right now, but I still representing District 1. You did, in the beginning, you talked about fundamental rights. And I think that we all remember the discussion at the Church of God, Pastor Gum's church, when the negotiating team from the UK was here, and there were some parts of the fundamental rights that were controversial in the discussion. I think that that is something as we go forward, we need to get the views of the people. So I don't know if you have with you the recommendations from the negotiating committee that were not decided upon, but certainly I think it would be good to raise that now if you could. There were discussions about the rights, religion, sex, those types of things. Maybe that those phrases can be raised so that persons can discuss.
Right. So, yeah, there were some issues there, and I guess one of the key issues were, like, for example, the definition of marriage and so on. And I think if folks remembered, I was not there, but I listened. That discussion there was a long one. Folks, so that as an Anglican, as a country, there was a particular view of what you take marriage to mean, basically between a man and wife. And the UK was saying, well, we have to be, we are signatory to certain conventions, and there's a view in the UK and so on. And so that was still an issue where there was a variance, and I'm not sure the extent to which it will be resolved, because you have folks who are, coming from really two different dimensions. But the UK government was quite strong in that. Yeah. So that is one example. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I saw a question online where it said, how can they have 21-member house paid $1,000 and a premier and other four paid $30,000 a month? I would say that if this comes a reality, certainly there would be some reorganization of the whole structure and payments and fees and so forth. So I believe it would be safe to say that all of that would be in the mix, so to speak, if that comes to that level.
Yeah,
yes, Tim?
Mr. Chair, I just happened to be standing here. I was the one who called those figures.
Mm-hmm.
I was simply making the point that those who are ministers of government and called upon to perform the duty of a minister of government deserve to be paid the appropriate pay, and those who are the backbenchers in the House deserve to be paid the appropriate pay. And that when you do the maths, you can have a House of Assembly with 21 persons, you can have a House of Assembly with 60 persons that cost less than a House with 11 or 12, depending on how you arrange the figures. So you rightly said it would be organized. What I did also say is that the person who is a backbencher, who is not required to go and sit in office for 8, 9, 10, 15, 20 hours a day, does not deserve the pay of the person who does that. So that's just simple maths there. Now, I rose to speak about the question of independence. Because from the 1980, what was it called again? The Angola Act, what I was talking about, the thing that had the Queens, whatever she called it there. But anyhow, she signed it all. I recall seeing the original document. It included a clause that said that Angola could become an independent republic. It actually used the words. In other words, it wasn't just become independent, but become a republic, like how Barbados is going very shortly, which meant the Queen will no longer be head of state. You could be. This was the Queen saying, if you wanted to be so free of us, you could be. Angolans could be. So that in itself is saying that should the Angolan people desire independence, that it could be, it is already allowed in order of council signed by Her Majesty, under the hand of Her Majesty. So that if Anguillians desire to be, now how do Anguillians desire to be? I know that there are some right in here who speak about independence, and I too speak about independence. What we need to do first, because if we are to be independent, we have got to approach independence with confidence. And we do not have that confidence when all of those commissions that we just spoke of do not exist. So people do things and say things and get up in the House of Assembly and make all kinds of accusations and so forth because they have the cover of the House of Assembly. And we have irresponsibility, or irresponsible people who act irresponsibly. When we want to approach independence, we must have that confidence in our systems, in our people, in our leadership, that we can manage having an independent country. Now, a lot of people do not realize that Angola essentially operated as an independent country from 1650 to 1825, that's 175 years. It was neither a part of the colony of the Virgin Islands or the colony of the Leeward Islands. It was out here, betwixt and between. So not surprisingly, Anguillians protested when they were brought under St. Kitts. It's not surprising that Anguillians protested. And by the way, the Kittitians protested too, because they didn't want to have to bother with this island on there as fit for nothing else but goats and whatever else. So, and then subsequent to that, in 1967, when Angola broke away from St. Kitts, it operated as an independent country for 2 years before the British invaded in 1969. So independence is not something that it should be a strange word to us, but we have got to get ourselves, develop the systems, and develop the trust and the confidence in each other as a people. And you know, I was in St. Lucia when St. Lucia went in independence in 1979, and Britain gave St. Lucia a gift, as it did to all those other territories at the time, of £10,000. Now, if they gave St. Lucia £10,000 in 1979, and they gave us £60 million in 2017, I would want to imagine that the £10 million by now, to one of their colonies that they were reading off, is £100 million. I would want to imagine that that's what at least we would negotiate for that. And with £100 million, we can get international airport, and we can get the other things that we are lacking, because we don't lack that much. We lack port facilities, we lack international airport. Go beyond that and tell me how much more we lack, right? So we can develop the infrastructure, and if we have the systems, and we have the confidence of our people, and we have the various things that protect our rights. Rights as citizens and rights as persons who work for the good of this country. If Minister Hodge decides tomorrow to go and lambast me on Cool FM, what can I do? I have to sit down and be quiet. Is that fair? Who will I complain to? And just that's across the board. I'm not talking about Timothy Hodge here. I'm talking about the principle of proper governance and the rights of people being respected and honored. So when we get past that, I think, and I would have loved to see Angola become independent in 2017, on our 50th birthday as a country. I would have loved to see it. But unfortunately, on the way there, we had a global financial crisis. And then in 2017, we had Irma. And now we got COVID. But once we get over these bumps, I really think that we should sit down and have a serious discussion among ourselves as a people as to what it is, like the eunuch by the river and Paul says to him, well, what hinders this guy from being baptized? What hinders us at that point from going forward? And let's work on those things. And then let's sit down and negotiate with the British. A nice £100 million golden handshake, they call it then. 1979, that's what they gave to St. Lucia and Antigua. I was there for independence too, 1981. And what kind of golden handshake they will give us? And then let's go. If we can't get an international airport out of Britain as a British territory, when the Falklands get one, and this place out in the middle of nowhere, what is it? St. Helena, get £200 million for an airport that they can't even use. And Falklands got an airport that they don't, that even if they could use it, they can't use it because who the devil want to fly down to Antarctica to the Falklands? Right? You mean to say we don't deserve an airport? So let's negotiate the things that we really want, and if you need to get out, get the hell out.
Thank you very much, Tim, for your thought-provoking comments, as always. Viewers, as you look on the screen, you will see our contact information there. So we're going to leave it up so you can email your comments or questions to kenneth.hodge@gov.ai, aiden.harrigan@gov.ai, or clarion.webster@gov.ai. If we don't have any further questions, we're going to begin to wrap up our session here this evening. Are there any other comments, feedback from the floor? There are no other further questions online. I would also like to throw out a few questions as well that has, been put out to me about whether our members should run for the offices they hold. So whether the Attorney General should be run for his office, whether the Minister of Finance, whether the Premier, these positions should run. This is one of the talks that have been coming at me as well for consideration. So I'm putting it out perhaps next so you can think about it and share your views. I just want to really make the point that we are maintaining a very open, transparent process. We really want to hear the views of the public. I think we get a lot of criticism that we engage in these processes, nobody participates, and then when we come up with the final product, people cry out and say they weren't involved. And these town halls are being held very deliberately to ensure that we engage the public in the various districts. We understand the rigors of COVID-19 that is going to impact the way that we are organizing these meetings, but this is something that we're going to have to learn to live with, and certainly we're going to organize to suit. So, ladies and gentlemen, if there are no further questions, I really want to thank all of you who came out this evening, especially Justice Don Mitchell, retired judge, and for sharing some wonderful ideas with us. The Premier, well, sorry, yes, he's from District 1. He says he also wants to be called District 1 here this evening, as well as Ms. Barbara Webster and all the others who shared questions online. We're going to be organizing the second meeting. We're going to come back to you, but I think the decision was taken that we're not really going to proceed in numerical order. We're going to kind of mix it up. So I think the next meeting will be somewhere in the West, and we're going to kind of go like that. So we're going to look at the current health situation. We're going to make a decision sometime next week as to what we're going to be doing. We're going to come back to you, the members of the public, let you know where we will be next, and we're going to invite you to be there as well to participate. This is a very important exercise, and I think this is how we're going to shape the future of Angola moving forward, the future of our Constitution, and certainly we want to see maximum participation. So we really want to thank everyone for coming out here this evening, and we look forward to joining you very soon. We want to thank Gaff and his team in Angola. We want to thank Ivan Connor, our Public Relations Officer. We want to thank Dites. We want to thank Lloyd's Live as well for facilitating our audio, visual, and streaming service here this evening. Thank you very much. Have a safe drive home, and we catch you very soon. Thank you.